Can you hear me okay? Is that okay? Cool. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the NHSN for having me. Yeah, I'm Tom, and I am a PhD student at Newcastle University. Today I'll be talking about the awful, disgusting, creepy enemies of the state that are otherwise known as invertebrates. And that's what the media and politicians would have you believe. I don't know if any of you have seen headlines like this recently. It's sort of the latest in a long line of sort of anti-invertebrate sentiments that have come across in the government and in the media. There was another recent one attacking jumping spiders. It seems probably just about the one thing that politicians either side can agree on. This is not just a Labour thing. I also saw it during the Conservatives. And we're also seeing it all the way across the world as well, as you can expect. It's a sort of a repeated pattern of invertebrates being ignored, being dropped from legislation, and even vilified in policy matters. I think George Monbiot put it really well recently, in that it's always the undesirable species. It's the species you might expect to find in a cauldron, which I think is particularly relevant at this time of year. It's not really ever the red squirrels. So today I want to ask the question, why is this kind of rhetoric dangerous? Why do we need to look out for our invertebrate species? So today I'll try and give you a brief overview of their importance. I'll also try to give you sort of a whistle-stop tour through some of England's environmental policy and where I think sort of local and national policy has and hasn't worked for invertebrate biodiversity. I'll mainly focus on planning policy because that's where my experience lies. I think you probably will all have heard many headlines and papers about how invertebrates are declining across the globe. All sorts of different groups of invertebrates, all sorts of different areas across the world. Some groups of invertebrates seem to be doing okay, but in general the picture is a particularly worrying one. Why does that matter? It matters for reasons like this. Incredible statistics just go to show that humans depend on invertebrates almost entirely. It's an unfortunate term, and one I don't really like, but the term is ecosystem services. The functions that invertebrates provide that are beneficial for humans. I think that's quite an anthropocentric way of viewing it, but oftentimes it's the only way to get policymakers to listen. I'll draw your attention that this was from 2006. This is obviously clearly an underestimate based, today's day and age, and it's also in the United States. But they're worth literally billions of dollars or pounds. I can talk all day in sort of monetary figures, but I think what drives the point home even further is talking in terms of mortality. So there was some fantastic work done recently by Matthew Smith, looking at pollinator deficits that exist already. So this is not projecting into the future. We're looking at what's happening to pollinators today and how that is affecting our food production. So Smith found that there are already huge gaps in the supply of pollinators for our crops. So that's due to extinctions and losses in diversity of pollinators. So we've got this pollinator deficit. And Smith links this pollinator deficit to around 427,000 annual deaths due to a loss of protein food consumption and malnutrition. So that's just under 1% of global deaths annually, and that's due to this pollinator deficit. And it's especially worrying because this is only going to get worse and worse as pollinators decline further. So, you know, I think the importance of invertebrates is perhaps most easy to demonstrate with pollinators and with the products from pollination, but sort of, I would think, less frequently talked about the invertebrate contributions to other ecosystem services, such as decomposition by things like these millipedes, nutrient cycling with these dung beetles, and things like natural pest control. Again, another monetary figure here, but the same paper estimated that the value of natural pest control was worth even more than pollination. So that's $4.5 billion annually in the US alone. So I think all of these so-called ecosystem services that are provided by invertebrates just emphasize that a healthy ecosystem is not a luxury. We need it, and it should never be lost on the docket when it comes to policy making. I want to take a brief aside to talk about my absolute favourite family of invertebrates, which are the ground beetles, the carabids. In general, these guys are a gardener's best friend, a farmer's best friend. Ground beetles are typically they're eating all sorts of garden and crop pests like slugs and caterpillars and weevils and things. They're a dominant insect family that are contributing to natural pest control globally. Again, I could talk all day about them. I think even just in the UK we have this amazing diversity in colour and form that we get within the carabids. It's not even known exactly why they're such amazing different colours, and closely related species have such different iridescent colours. And it's not pigment, it's light diffracting in the microstructure of the exoskeleton that gives us these amazing rare colours. The process is very similar to the kind of iridescence you see on the backs of DVDs and on soap bubbles and things like that. So as I mentioned, they're crucially important for natural pest control, and I was lucky enough to give ground beetles a bit of propaganda on Countryfile a couple of years ago, and try to win people over and say that you need to leave log piles in your gardens and you need to leave refuges of uncut bits in your lawn so that you can encourage ground beetles and they'll eat all the slugs, which I still stand by. And I was really happy that ground beetles were finally getting the attention that I thought they deserved on TV. And then I read the comments on Twitter and I found that most people actually didn't agree with me, unfortunately, which I think is very unfair because I think we get foxes every week on Countryfile. I think it's a rather funny example of a potentially more sobering problem of this general anti-invertebrate undercurrent that's quite pervasive in society, I think. Again, ground beetles are wicked. There's about 360 species in the UK. I and quite a lot of colleagues have used them as study organisms in ecological studies because for several reasons, but one of the main ones is that studies have shown that they're actually quite good indicators of wider biodiversity. So they can be quite good as proxies for looking at wider invertebrate biodiversity, but also even vertebrate biodiversity. They're also not particularly mobile and they reproduce relatively quickly. So that means that if we are having changes to habitats due to things like policy or due to development, you tend to see changes to ground beetle abundances and also to ground beetle sort of species profiles very quickly. So they're a really, really useful study group. And that's why we use them as a bit of a focal point for testing policies like biodiversity net gain, which I expect quite a lot of you have heard about. It's quite it's got a certain reputation that comes along with it, but this is a statutory environmental policy that was introduced in February 2024. It's a statutory requirement for new housing and infrastructure developments. It's going through a bit of a shake-up at the moment, which I won't get into too much detail about, but there were fears that it was going to be scrapped entirely for a while. And that's something I wouldn't advocate for necessarily, because I think on paper it's a really great idea. So with respect to planning policy, previously all we had in this country was an assurance that developers would deliver no net loss of biodiversity. So that means that developments had to not harm the environment. With biodiversity net gain, the idea is that the developer leaves the environment 10% better off than it was before the development. So what the developer has to do is they have to measure the biodiversity or quantify the biodiversity at the baseline or pre-development, and then evidence the ways in which they're going to improve the biodiversity by 10% post-development. And that can be done through either enhancing existing habitats or by creating new habitats. And both of those can be done on-site, so within the development footprint, or off-site, outside of the development boundary. And I don't need to get too far into the details of how the biodiversity net gain, the 10%, is quantified, but it all comes down to this thing, the therefore term, the biodiversity metric. It's a type of area condition metric, which basically means that the value of biodiversity is derived from the area of the habitat and the relative quality of that habitat. So there are no species diversity-based measures going into this thing. So yeah, when we're deciding the quality of the habitat, we look at two main things. The first one is distinctiveness, which is basically a measure of the uniqueness of the habitat in an English environmental context, so how rare it is, basically. And then the condition is the quality of that particular habitat parcel relative to some sort of perceived optimum for that type of habitat. So, you know, has the habitat been degraded? It's then multiplied by this thing called strategic significance, which is what I would consider a woefully inadequate way of asking whether the habitat contributes to strategic priorities, conservation priorities for the county. So what we did, this was with colleagues at Oxford University, we set out to ask whether this so-called biodiversity metric, this proxy for biodiversity, actually lined up with any sort of real-world measures of biodiversity. And because I love them, we focused a lot on ground beetles, but we also looked at various other different types of organisms as well. So we went out and assessed a bunch of habitats in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire under the biodiversity net gain metric, and then compared it to more traditional measures of things like species richness and abundance. So along the x-axis there is the metric score for all of the graphs, and then along the y is various measures of invertebrate species richness and things like that. We found absolutely zero hard evidence for any relationship between a so-called biodiversity metric and real-world measures of biodiversity, which was quite depressing. So other people have since, found similar worrying lack of trends. So Cicely Marshall found the same lack of trends for things like butterflies and birds. So all in all, this kind of suggested that scores generated using the B and G metric might not represent invertebrate biodiversity or abundance very well. And if we're not seeing a correlation with things like ground beetles, which, as I've said, are typically quite widely accepted indicators of wider biodiversity, then we've got a problem. We tried to look further, so we tried to unpick this. What's going on? Why is biodiversity net gain falling short with its metric? One of the things we identified was problems with condition scoring. So a big value, a big multiplier in this metric, in this spreadsheet, that contributes quite significantly to the biodiversity units. We found that was very florally focused. It's very reliant on vegetation features. In terms of condition scoring, we found that actually, by focusing on vegetation features alone, it was penalising important habitat features for invertebrates. So things like bare ground, which is absolutely vital for nesting solitary bees and oil beetles, scrub as well, which is vital for overwintering and egg laying for invertebrates. Even species of wildflower that are deemed indicative of suboptimal condition, they're undesirable wildflowers, they're all penalised in the B&G metric if you go above 5% cover. Yeah, I was particularly worried about that. So what we thought, is B&G going to regularly undervalue habitats that are actually of high value for invertebrates? And since then, that's exactly what we found. This is an arable margin. It doesn't look like much, and the metric, biodiversity metric, doesn't value it very highly. It has a blanket poor condition score. You cannot change the condition score of an arable margin in the B&G metric. So it scored very poorly, but what we found was an absolute amazing diversity of ground invertebrates. We found things like bombardier beetle, which is a nationally scarce beetle. One of my absolute favourites. It fires a hot corrosive substance on its bum, just to deter predators. The same was true for this nice, according to the metric, not very nice grassland habitat. You've got thistles, you've got scrub. It ranked very, very poorly under the biodiversity metric, but yet we found high diversity of invertebrates in general, and some particularly rare species like the necklace ground beetle, Carabus manilis, which is Britain's fastest declining ground beetle. It's listed as endangered in the UK IUCN Red List. It is an indicator of high quality floodplain habitats. So the fact that we found many in a particularly poorly scoring grassland habitat within the biodiversity metric was quite worrying. Again, just to go back to the scrub and the thistles, within the metric, we were seeing this sort of perverse blanket incentive to remove vital habitat features for invertebrates. So I've spoken quite a lot there about an unrepresentative metric, but that's just one part of one of the ways in which policies of net gain or no net loss can fall short for invertebrates and show gains on paper that aren't actually being delivered in the real world. So we can really learn from other policies of things like no net loss and net gain across the world. And one of the key markers of success that comes up quite frequently is governance. In other words, what is the legislation that's being laid out to ensure that the policy is being monitored and enforced properly? And it might seem really simple on paper. If you have a developer promising a habitat, surely someone, for example the government, should check that it's actually being delivered. Why then have the government not allocated nearly enough money for monitoring and enforcement? I don't know. At the moment, the burden of proof, or otherwise, for things like B&G, so the burden of proof that something's going wrong or something's going right basically falls on the local planning authority. So the county council are checking whether the developer meets B&G requirements. And currently, I would say local planning authorities are almost criminally understaffed, underfunded. So a lot of these B&G applications are being waved through with no real checking going on. And as I say, although the government has promised about £16.7 million to B&G monitoring and enforcement, experts tend to agree that doesn't come anywhere near close to the required amount for monitoring. And unfortunately, we have seen what happens in other countries if you don't monitor and enforce environmental policies well. You get pictures like this. You get promises of habitats being delivered that aren't delivered in the real world, and sometimes even worse. Sometimes degradation where restoration has been promised. The same thing has proven to be true in the UK as well. There was an amazing report recently called I think it's Wild Justice, they looked at how many, or the proportion of ecological mitigation actions that were actually delivered on the ground. Almost half of the ecological mitigations that are promised by developers are not delivered when you go and check them on the ground. Most egregious examples are, again, typically quite undesirable animals. You've got 100% of invertebrate boxes that were promised by developers missing in actuality. So if you've got this lack of an appropriate biodiversity metric and a lack of effective governance, you've got invertebrates being dealt a bit of a double whammy. And with respect to BNG, it's just one of many environmental policies in which impacts on invertebrates have been failed to have been addressed. I'd recommend giving this a read if you want a depressing read, but it's a really sort of important window into how much gets promised on paper and how much passes all these regulations and checks, but it actually isn't delivered in the real world. I've spoken a lot, quite sort of depressingly, about how poor national policies have been, but I think locally there's some chance to do some real good. I'd give an example of the biodiversity duty, which was introduced in the 2021 Environment Act. It's rather vague, but it basically sets out that public authorities should act to conserve and enhance biodiversity, and they should then document this and publish this, and then that goes back to the government. And conserving and enhancing biodiversity can include things like reviewing their waste policies, their water policies, and how they manage their estate. And I think this is a great way in which sort of the average person, we can get involved and push for change. I sort of recommend emailing local councillors and the council themselves, reminding them that they have a legal obligation to meet the biodiversity duty. Or even if they're already doing things like leaving unknown verges and things, you can compliment them online. And having worked alongside county councils, I know how many complaints they receive relative to compliments, and how often the management of things like the public land and estates, how often that is influenced by one or two complaints. So if you like wildflower verges, then give them compliments on it. I think the biodiversity duty is only going to get more and more important as we start to realise some of these frankly, to say the least, ambitious housing targets. We're going to get a lot of new housing estates. Under BNG, developers meeting their 10% net gain, we're going to get a lot of urban growth within these housing estates. Alongside the house building targets, you've got the BNG requirement. That will lead to a lot of urban grassing. What can we do about it? If our back's against the wall, if we're just going to get urban grassing, what can we do about it? That's what I'm looking into at the moment with Northumberland County Council. We can review the local authority's maintenance and management policies for its estates, and then that can contribute to their biodiversity duty. So I don't know if any of you have seen these signs up across some of the towns in Northumberland, but this is me doing fieldwork with the county council, and the idea here is how can we manage urban grasslands using local authority resources in the best way for things like invertebrates and plants. I think that's really, really important, especially in urban areas where we're going to get a lot more housing estates. Wildlife's going to be pushed into smaller and smaller areas. Wildlife needs these corridors and stepping stones of high quality, where it's typically hard for wildlife to disperse through urban areas. So I've been out all spring and summer sort of testing different urban grassland management regimes as part of the PhD. So that's Den and Anna. They're amazing students at Newcastle University, and they're collecting important plant and invertebrate biodiversity data. And then that is me looking and feeling particularly idiotic after I managed to decide to do fieldwork on the one rainy day this summer. We're just quite stupid. But with this work, we're also looking at some sort of new monitoring methods for invertebrate biodiversity. So we're looking at environmental DNA methods, where you kind of collect environmental DNA, like insect scales that have been left on flowers, and then you sequence that data. And the aim is that that will hopefully speed up the processing and generating of invertebrate biodiversity figures and metrics. That's one of the most important sort of blockers to getting invertebrates into policy, is that people just say there's too many and they're too difficult to identify, so we can't quantify them. This is very much an ongoing project. I've just started my second year, so there are no results yet, but obviously, yeah, stay tuned if you're interested. I think I included this because I just think it's so important to sort of visualize an urban grassland from a network perspective. It sort of once again demonstrates that everything's connected. We're part of the ecosystem, and sort of anything we do for wildlife is very reciprocal. We'll reap the benefits. So for example, if with the council we manage bits of grassland for increased wildflower diversity, you're also going to see increased pollinator diversity, and you're going to get some allotments, crops being pollinated, and more widely, farm pollination. But also, you start to see these slightly maybe less apparent relationships. For example, mental and physical well-being being associated with increases in biodiversity. And on a really positive note, this was like the most exciting thing for me this summer was during my work doing this field work in these very, very tightly mown amenity grassland areas. They'd be mown within an inch of their life for decades, and then a couple of months later, without any sowing of seeds, just from changing the mowing regimes, instantly start to see things that are actually already in the seed bank of the soil. So instantly had things like knapweed, loads of different types of clover, yarrow, even some dactylorhiza orchids straight away without sowing, which is fantastic. And then with that came some fantastic invertebrates that I didn't expect to see. So we had this hoverfly Chrysotoxum festivum, which is a really rare invertebrate in Northumberland. It's only been recorded at a few sites before. And that was found in a previously very, very barren urban grassland site in Prudhoe. So that was fantastic. So just to summarise, I think sort of looking forward, there are a few sort of key principles that can be used to achieve effective invertebrate policy, or effective environmental policy for invertebrate biodiversity, I should say. So as I touched on before, currently a lot of the metrics that are used in policy tend to ignore or even penalise invertebrate requirements. So more representative metrics would be a key one. I just touched on that earlier, but the possibility for including novel invertebrate biomonitoring methods for inclusion in policy, I think would really sort of speed things up and get around some of those economic and time constraints for including invertebrates. And I keep harping on about it, but I think this is just the key one. I think if you want to deliver something on the ground, for example, with grounds maintenance policies, like with the council, I would argue they need to be really transparent and participatory. So you need to tell residents what's going on throughout the process, and even more than that, residents need to be able to inform the process. So, for example, informing, where's best for biodiversity uplifts, because at the end of the day, the residents and local people are the ones who are going to be using those green spaces, and the effective environmental policy of any kind needs local support, and that's what we're hoping to do with the county council. And just finally, after a presentation full of depressing headlines, I want to end on a more positive note. That there have been some positives for invertebrate biodiversity in policy recently. So there were some bans on some terrifyingly harmful pesticides. There are some EU extensions to protect spiders, which is kind of the antithesis of what the Prime Minister was saying on the first slide. But, and then just a couple of weeks ago, there was this looming threat of weakening protections for national parks and national landscapes. That has now been dropped after 200 signatories calling for stronger protection. So I think these three headlines just go to show that campaigning and protesting sometimes does work, and just sometimes the government does listen. And very finally, in the case of biodiversity net gain, I think it can be done well, especially where developers are paying experts who care, like the wildlife trusts, paying them to deliver the required biodiversity net gains. In these so-called habitat banks, we're actually seeing some tangible habitat lifts. And I think in habitat banks, they're often transparent, they're often well monitored, where they're being run by people who actually care. So I think in the toolkit of things like biodiversity net gain and the biodiversity duty, there are the tools to achieve effective policy for invertebrates. It just has to be done by expert organisations and by county councils that actually care about it, and then we'll have some good done. So I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Thank you very much.